All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm here with Tijana Okić, who's a returning guest. The first conversation that Tijana joined us with was how to be a Marxist. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I guess it was over a year ago. I highly recommend you check it out. This was the one you'll see with the thumbnail of Neo from The Matrix. And Tijana had this spontaneous point of, like, sometimes as a Marxist, you need to just stop and let all of the chaos just gather so that you can see more clearly. And it was a great conversation, Tijana. Thanks for coming back. Today, we want to turn to a conversation on the German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch. Two things to note. On this channel, you'll see that we have a video essay that I did on Bloch's concept of the not yet conscious, which, is a very psychoanalytic concept. It's very much Bloch's attempt to identify a principle that's not present in sort of bourgeois psychoanalysis, not present in Freud, sort of this anticipatory consciousness of the future, of what's to come. He argues that Freud's theory of the unconscious has no conception of the future. So check that out. And then we also tried to do a reading group on the principle of hope by Ernst Bloch, but as we were just talking, Tijana, his texts are so deep, they're so layered. This text was actually written in exile when he was in the United States, which I think is an interesting biographical point.
Supported by his wife, she was working, he wasn't. Who was an architect, his second wife. His first wife was came from a very bourgeois family, and after the Russian Revolution, their mines, I believe it was the mines, were nationalized. And then he used to say after that, jokingly, her name was Elise von Stritsky, and Bloch always used to say jokingly that he already paid for the revolution. So,
Fascinating. Yes, Ernst Bloch was they say, like, when he was studying philosophy, one of his classmates was Lukács, and let's say they were very close. Right? They said that they would go to social events and they could finish one another's sentences. Both of them are unique because at the time they were communists who were Hegelians, which could get you in a lot of trouble, and did get Bloch in a lot of trouble. But it was not just that, because Bloch also, and I think this is partially where Lukács had a hard time with him, really turned to Schelling in the foundation of his philosophical outlook and system. So Tijana's joined us to talk about one particular distinction, kind of like a kind of historical concept that Bloch creates for Marxist and, frankly, for revolutionary thought. This distinction between the warm and the cold stream of Marxism. A lot of people reference it. Perhaps many people don't really know, or rather, it warrants a lot of clarification. Are you a cold or are you warm? Or is this conception to be understood as some kind of immanent synthesis that's already present within every Marxist practice? So, Tijana, let me kick it to you for an opening general question regarding your understanding of this distinction that he develops, a little more than halfway through the principle of hope. What's the best way to get a hold of it?
Okay. I think it's notwithstanding the appearance, as it were, of your question that is only seemingly simple. It's actually a very complicated philosophical question. Before I try and answer it, I do want to say another thing. There are those interviews, I think, Leo Koffler and Heinz Holz, who did the later interviews with Bloch and Lukács, and where Bloch says that basically while he was in gymnasium, so in high school, he had read all Hegel by the age of 16. extremely erudite. One of the running jokes I used to have with one of my friends from the university was, it was easy for Adorno and everybody to write books that they did because, they had a joker called Ernst Bloch. So he was certainly one of the probably most erudite Marxists of the 20th century. I'm not saying that others were not as erudite, but he was certainly an exception. And Adorno himself, as you know, in his Schriften zur Literatur, he himself says that he probably did not write anything after reading The Spirit of Utopia, which did not contain, in a way, a germ or an idea or a thought from this book. So the legacy of Ernst Bloch, I think, is much wider than one kind of assumes initially. As for the distinction between the warm stream and cold stream of Marxism, which Bloch introduces, I think it's a philosophical distinction, but I don't think, I think it's both philosophical and a historical distinction, because one should also, bear in mind that Bloch, like Lukács, amongst other things, and tendentially people who have the idea of Lukács as being some cold, in severe quotation marks, a cold Stalinist, people would tend to, place Lukács in a Stalinist kind of current, which would be the cold current. But at the same time, he's the so-called Western Marxist, and can easily be placed in the warm current. What I'm saying is that historically speaking, the thought of both Bloch and Lukács develops, and this is only because you mentioned their friendship and so on and so forth, develops as Leninism. The core of their philosophical thoughts after becoming Marxists has always been Leninism, in fact. And what Leninism is, Bloch places even Lenin in the cold stream, in the warm stream, in a warm stream of Marxism. Why? Because it's the criticism of the economic determinism of the Second International, And that's kind of, I think one has to look at this distinction not merely as a philosophical one, but also as the one which was historically conditioned, but found its place later within Bloch's development and Bloch's system. Because when Bloch was writing, and arguably one could say that both The Spirit of Utopia and History and Class Consciousness are two different attempts to come to terms or to speak the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, in their own way, are both works which are actually very distant from the cold stream, and could be placed within the warm stream of Marxism. Why? Precisely because they don't accept the mechanical and economistic view of history, as it were. So that's kind of the primary thing and the most important thing, I would say. That there are historical reasons for this, but they also, in Bloch's philosophy, find, precisely because his philosophy is so incredibly erudite, and because of the style that he writes in, which is very kind of difficult to penetrate, as it were, finds its philosophical explanation as well.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. So the warm stream is a kind of, it's a sort of historical claim that stretches into the pre-capitalist experience of human emancipatory movements. In a sense, it is an impulse of freedom that animates collective humanity we could say perhaps at any given time. Therefore, then the conditions of the class struggle determine the expression of this warm stream. So my second question is regarding this aspect, this historical aspect of what he says as the warm stream of Marxism is the yearning for freedom for a classless society. It's the yearning for freedom of the no longer alienated form of social existence. Therefore, it's directly connected, in fact, to another concept he develops, which we've talked about before, called the not yet conscious, in the sense that it's something also that the proletariat, or the kind of revolutionary class, what Bloch often calls the rising class, taps into. So, in a sense, it's kind of a kind of aspect of that form of consciousness, of revolutionary consciousness, of the active side of Marxism. So does he mean by that a way of understanding, is this distinction between warm and cold a way of understanding these exterior forces within social movements? Or is he really talking about this distinction between warm and cold as types of Marxist intellectuals, right? That's one thing that kind of, I think, needs some clarification, right? Like, is this a tendency internal to Marxists, or is this a kind of trans-historical concept with broader applications to, like, this is how we understand the Jacobins, this is how we understand the Munster
I
Rebellion?
wouldn't call it trans-historical. It's certainly historical and materialist in the sense in which Marx intends historical materialism. So I would kind of shy away from using the word trans-historical. But if you think about the obviously the human struggle for emancipation, which was always accompanied, by at the same time, the dialectics, which is, emancipation, disemancipation, has been long and arduous one. And I think if you think about the Jacobins, they also have, their in a way their role models or their inspiration in the past, in the Roman Republic, as it were. The Bolsheviks have their own inspiration in a way in Jacobins, and the famous when they go out to celebrate because the Russian Revolution has withheld one day more than the French Revolution. So I think then again, Bloch would say the peasant war. Even today, for example, Jacques Rancière would certainly say that the beginning is again in the conflict between in Rome. Slave uprisings, revolts, various historical events, and I'm not using this word in any particular philosophical, I'm using it simply as a historical kind of determination, are certainly part of the long tradition of human emancipation, which came to fruition with lesser or with more or less success with the French Revolution and certainly with the Russian Revolution. And I think one should bear this in mind because, as Marx used to say, ex nihilo nihil fit, so nothing comes out of nothing. And I think that's kind of an important thing to kind of keep in mind. As for your question, whether or not it's the type of Marxist intellectuals, I don't know. I'm not really convinced that this is always the case. So let's take the example of Lo Surdo. Many people would say that Lo Surdo is a cold stream of Marxism, whereas in Lo Surdo you can also find the elements of the so-called warm stream Marxism. In Lukács, many people would say he's a Stalinist, hence he's a cold stream, whereas in reality many people would place him in warm stream. It's the same, Russell Jacobi, who wrote the Dialectics of Defeat. I think that was the title of the book. The book, which was in a way probably a response to Perry Anderson's considerations on Western Marxism, because Perry Anderson is 76, and Russell Jacobi's book is 1980. So I think one should see those two books as kind of, conversing in a way. And, if you take Russell Jacobi to be as like an ultra-left idea and criticism, but there's one kind of valid point which seems to me stands as far as I remember, which he makes at the beginning of the book, that when we think of Marxisms, people will say, Eastern Marxism, Western Marxism, Chinese Marxism, Soviet Marxism, Yugoslav Marxism, and none of these determinations is actually helpful. There is no national Marxism. Marxism is a kind of a internationalist from its very beginning, which is why I'm kind of really dislike the whole idea. And everybody today publishing texts, the transnational, international. I mean, are you kidding me? Yes, Marxism was international, was indeed an internationalist movement, and we are now discovering that this is a transnational movement. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous, kind of the discovery of the hot water and using the term transnational today. But to go back to my point, I think these kinds of divisions are often, how can I put it? I wouldn't say merely artificial, but I think occasionally they can serve a polemical purpose. Occasionally they can be politically charged. Occasionally they can be used as a kind of a philosophical attempt to say, okay, you're, an idealist, you're a materialist, you're this, you're, in other words, to make those kinds of points. Whereas in reality, I think it's not so clear cut, is what I'm saying. It's impossible to really clearly state one thing or the other. As many of the examples, as I said, Lukács and Losurdo being the two, I think, really obvious ones. So it's not quite clear that we can use these as designations for intellectuals, is what I meant to say.
Yes. I mean, part of the challenge, I think, also is the dialectical nature of the cold and warm stream. And I want to read a quick passage from the Principle of Hope, which I think will elucidate this argument that Bloch makes, because what I'm about to read will kind of indicate, I think, pretty well that what he intends here is that the two poles or the two tendencies are meant to work in a kind of reinforcing synchronicity with one another. So he says, quote, "Only coldness and warmth of concrete anticipation together therefore ensure that neither the path in itself nor the goal in itself are held apart from one another undialectically, and if they were, they would become reified and isolated." And the conditional analysis on the whole historical situational stretch emerges both as an unmasking of ideologies and as disenchantment of metaphysical illusion. That's the cold stream. So the cold stream has a risk, if it were on its own, to fall into a kind of cold economism, because what it's concerned with is the late Marx analysis of the value form and commodity fetishism and the sort of scientific categories of capital in some sense. Precisely this belongs, he says, to the most useful cold stream of Marxism. Through it, Marxist materialism becomes not only the science of conditions, but at the same time the science of struggle and opposition against all ideological inhibitions and concealments of the ultimately decisive conditions, which are always economic. Okay, that's the cold stream. To the warm stream of Marxism, however, belong liberating intention and materialistically humane, materialistic real tendencies, towards whose goal all these disenchantments are undertaken. Yeah. From here, the strong appeal to the debased, enslaved, abandoned, belittled human being. From here, the appeal to the proletariat as the turntable towards emancipation. So this is very fascinating in my estimation, because without the analytic cold stream, which has the function of an ideological disenchantment, you don't really have an adequate revolutionary upsurge. In other words, perhaps you could say, Tijana, that there will always be spontaneous antagonisms within the class struggle without the cold stream. Like, you see my point. In other words, the cold stream is necessary. This analytic is necessary to steer the restless agitation, the uprisings, etc., to give it a direction. I wonder if that's a helpful way to think about it in some sense. Not so much as imminent to
I
My
would certainly say that it is,
yeah.
and I think that the idea of Bloch is not really to counterpose these two currents and to say we need only one, we should disregard the other, because um, what's relevant and what seems to me often is kind of not really missed, but not really taken so much into consideration. And I will again take the example of Bloch and Lukács, just because they are kind of contemporaries, have, they're both have a similar path, and they're both readers of Hegel, and they're both readers of primarily young Marx. I'm not saying that they're not readers of Capital. Obviously, Lukács being in Moscow, he could have familiarized himself, which he indeed did, with Marx's works more and prior to Bloch, who was in the United States at the time, and so on and so forth. But if you take these two examples, they are very different confrontations, very different iterations of essentially reading or considering two great philosophers, that is Hegel and Marx, as their main interlocutors, and I think it's kind of really relevant because it points to the fact that reading the same things and reading the same authors and standing on their shoulders, as it were, gives you completely two different types of engagement with the same thought. So Bloch's idea is not to counterpose the cold stream, although certainly he was critical of Stalinism. One has to kind of accentuate this, but it is not to say that we don't need theory, as it were, the correct theory, that we don't need the scientific part, that we don't need certain theoretical ideas which will then guide the movement, nor, on the other hand, is he saying that everything can be indeed the result of the spontaneous action of the masses. So I think it is some kind of a historical balance between the two. And honestly, I think that is, however, many people will probably find this not really something they would or could agree. But I think the same can be said of Lukács, and that is the question which I think is crucial for both Bloch and Lukács, and that is the role of ontology in politics. That's the central question. That's the central question. So it is not, I think we've been, how can I put it? Marxism has for so long been dominated by the Anglo-Saxon academic version for the last 60, almost 70 years, almost, with, well, some notable exceptions, obviously, but I'm talking about, in particular, the end of 90s, certainly the last 40 years, but even more. And I think the problem with this domination, in particular in universities, and is the question, on the one hand, epistemology, on the other hand, ontology. So the idea is, if you pose the question of epistemology, you have to necessarily get rid of ontology, and the other way around. If you place the ontology, then there is no space for epistemology, in a way. And I think that this is, again, a wrong counterposition. And I think that the work of both Bloch and Lukács testifies to this, because what is Lukács's great project, his last great project? It is the ontology of social being. It is an attempt to say that we can't have politics, that we can't have theory, that we can't have action, as it were, that we can't have neither the politicization nor hence the emancipation of the masses without developing some kind of ontology. And that is also Bloch's idea. Bloch's incessantly, I mean, absolutely incessantly. That's that's kind of present throughout all of his books, whereas the Anglo-Saxon Marxism would often object to this idea of introducing ontology to politics, and would say, that this is the accusation which is often geared against Badiou, for example, that he attempts to kind of ontologize the politics. And but I think it's perfectly legitimate to actually oppose this Anglo-Saxon epistemology domination, and to open a discussion and to talk about what would it mean to include a certain kind of epistemology. And in one of the emails I exchanged a couple of months ago with Darko Suvin, who I always mention, and Darko, who has lived in Canada for quite a while, and made his career there, and he said, no, in this world, what would the ontology be? In this world of wars, of slaughtering, of it's just the world is too ugly. No, we need epistemology. And I'm like, I disagree with you about this. I disagree about this, and I think that's ultimately the question. That's ultimately the question, that we need both. And warm stream Marxism, well, the way Bloch conceives it, in his noble idea that we are still at the beginning, which I think is a great thought, that we as humanity are still at the beginning, which is reminiscent of Lukács's interview, which I always mention, where he says that we need to behave as if, we were at the beginning, when the workers' movement is just beginning to form, and everything is kind of behind us, but at the same time, which is a very Blochian, if you think about it. So all the revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, are behind us, but at the same time in front of us as the experience that we have already had.
That's very helpful. Because if the cold stream is the ideological unmasking of forms of domination, right? That first applies to capitalist and pre-capitalist societies alike, because we've already established that the distinction moves prior to the 1830s and industrial capitalism, and therefore Bloch is capable of seeing cold stream elements within Christianity, within other religious movements. What it depends upon is the unmasking of the dominant classes ideology. And for Bloch, there is a recognition in the principle of hope that the post-war period, you see, because he has his own conception of ideology critique, right, that he brings out, which is very different, I think, than the culture industry of Adorno and Horkheimer, by the way, because he's trying to use this concept of what he calls the kind of implicit utopian impulse, which exists within bourgeois ideology, but which bourgeoisie is incapable of making legible or of seeing, because he makes this beautiful claim that dominant ideology is not capable of, they only touch it in art. They only touch the utopian impulse in art, and that's why much of Principle of Hope and much of Bloch's writings, I slightly disagree with you, Tijana, is extraordinarily accessible, because it's basically pop culture critique as well as high culture critique. So he's able to kind of create these genealogies of cultural study, from drama, from fine music, from film, and identify these potentialities. And I want to actually ask you, now that you mentioned ontology, to maybe speak to that a little bit. Part of the reason that Schelling is so important for Bloch is because he thinks that Schelling gives a theory of matter, which is always being impossibility. So the future is open with Schelling's metaphysics, whereas he does read Hegel as presenting a conception which is not open. And that's a strong contention, whatever. He makes a defense of Schelling. I wonder what you think about that. He obviously has this other beautiful set of investigations into Aristotle's conception of matter being impossibility, which he sees as quite revolutionary, and also which changes the very meaning of revolution, because in a sense, revolution is an always unfinished project, in some sense. So
It's permanent, you know.
yeah, he has this. He has a theory. He has a theory of becoming, which obviously also takes on Heidegger, takes
And
on
Hegel.
and Hegel, and takes on the Nietzschean Heideggerian legacy of becoming, right? Which he sees as fascistic. I mean, he has a whole section, for example, on psychoanalysis, and he sees Jung as definitely the fascist end of psychoanalysis. He's not fond of Heidegger, as far as I can tell. Can you speak some to Bloch's theory of ontology?
Well, I think again, it's a very complicated question, and I'm, really more modest in my in my attempt here because I'm not, I'm not a Bloch expert, and I think it's a very complicated question. The one he was criticized for by Lukács, as we all know, his book, the Erbschaft dieser Zeit, so the heredity of our times, I think is the English translation, is his 1930s essays.
Heritage.
So yeah, heritage. So it's not necessarily. I dislike the idea of placing it, whether he was correct or whether he was not correct. What I like to think about is what we can take from this. Obviously, he's anti-Heideggerian. Why? Because he takes Heidegger's ontology, much like Lukács, by the way, later and he criticizes it as ontological individualism. As ontology, which is based on, and indeed it is, its primary feeling is angst. It is the fear. Is that the English translation? It is the fear, and it's the death, and those are kind of crucial aspects, crucial concepts of Heidegger's ontology. Whereas Bloch, in the Principle of Hope, wants to say that death is not the end, but not merely in the sense of Christianity or monotheistic religions where we believe in some kind of life after the death where we resurrect and unite with whatever is out there. No, his idea is to say we experience death while we are alive. Death is the experience of our everyday life, not in the sense that you are familiar with the death because other people die, but that's something that's kind of so co-natural to life itself, and mainly criticizes Heidegger's ontology on these presuppositions. And indeed, yes, I mean, Heidegger's ontology is the ontology of ontological individualism and fear, because what is it? It's a fear for a certain class, and certainly for a certain class position, if you want, or for a certain class as such. So I think Bloch's ontology may be have its ups and downs. How can I put it? But he certainly makes valid points, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in these valid points. Just like in his, I think maybe it's his last book. And please don't take me, my word, but it might be one of his certainly last, if not the last book, which is the Experimentum Mundi, which I don't know if it was translated in English. It was translated in former Yugoslavia. Much of Bloch, as you know, he was a guest, quite happily seen guest at the Praxis Korčula School, and so on and so forth. And he dedicates this book to whom? To Rosa Luxemburg, as bye-bye to, as a sort of a bye-bye to everybody. And kind of preparing for this conversation, I was reading elements or pieces, because it's been really ages since I read Bloch in Serbo-Croatian. Ever since Italian became my second language, I'm now mostly reading things in Italian or in English. And I don't have the German, and plus Bloch's German is, my God, very, very difficult, even for people who speak German. I think it's, very, very difficult. And I was reading it, and he makes a point where he says, he's talking about Lukács's ontology of social being, and agrees with Lukács on a fundamental point that a category as such, and there's obviously Hegelian elements here, there are Aristotelian elements, and they both go back to what they're the classics, I would say. They are the people who read philosophical classics. They are not the ones who will read, just any book that is published, maybe. But they study classics, and that's their education. In that sense, they are kind of the maybe the last dinosaurs, if we exclude a Catholic priest or something or whatever. And he says, Lukács makes a valid point in the ontology of social being, or the preparation for the ontology of social being, because category itself is already an existential determination. So it's not just a determination of thoughts, it is existential determination. I think that's quite a relevant point to understand how they see ontology, how they understand the ontology. And if you counterpose that, for example, to what Perry Anderson says in Considerations on Western Marxism, when the masses speak, the intellectuals will be silent. It is, the difference is abysmal. It's kind of abysmal between these two positions. Why? Because, thinking itself is already, a la Aristotle, thinking itself is already an activity, a concrete activity.
Yes, and it's
to return to your question and to the idea that there is a unity between the cold and warm streams.
Yes.
I know this might seem, at least the way Bloch conceives it, this might seem blasphemous to many people, but that's Bloch's idea. That is Bloch's idea. So I think it's relevant for the way they conceive ontology. Frankly,
I want to turn to the question of ontology with Lukács. If one reads History and Class Consciousness, famously, I think many will accuse that project to primarily be operating within the realm of epistemological analysis. And then, of course, there's the accusation that it's largely founded on the neo-Kantian Marxism, right? Why? Well, because the whole conception of proletariat vis-a-vis the truth of the standpoint, the whole idea of standpoint comes from the neo-Kantians themselves. And however, there's something deeply liberating about that conception. And in a sense, if we throw early Lukács, onto Bloch's distinction, that makes him actually a cold stream thinker. Why? Because this question of the standpoint is about the unmasking of the ideological, the revelation, the revealing of the alienation, I think. Right? Maybe you could say it's both, but in a certain sense, the epistemological is bound up with the cold stream analytic endeavor. I wonder if you agree with that. And then secondly, if you do, could we then map this epistemological piece onto the task of what cold stream Marxism does in general? And because for me, I was so moved, and I think even also in Losurdo, much of what Losurdo is trying to do is also at this same level, especially when he always brings out this wonderful distinction between nominalism and realism and things of this nature. It's very much working in the field of epistemology. Now,
I tend to disagree on that, which is why I gave Losurdo as one of the examples, because and Losurdo himself kept repeating this. And for example, the Italian philosopher Roberto Finelli, in one of the discussions, he objects to Losurdo that his philosophy does not possess, that he ignores, as it were, this kind of, under quotation marks, what we could call in this discussion the warm stream. So the subjective element, the utopian element, the anthropological element. And Losurdo says it's no. No. The question of recognition cannot be separated. You can say that it's an epistemological question, but it's at the same time ontological question, if you want. How can you separate the struggles, anti-colonial struggles, and the question of recognition from a certain kind of ontology? You can't. It's not just a question of epistemology. It is also the question of ontology. So I tend to disagree, and for the same reason, I tend to disagree with Lukács. Yes, one would say tentatively, The History and Class Consciousness is a book where epistemological themes dominate. Yes and no, because the point of that book is the subject-object. So it is two sides. It has two sides. It is not just one-sided book. And this is why I also at the beginning gave the example of Lukács as somebody who is often placed within the cold stream, accused of being Stalinist, whereas in reality you can find other elements. Just like people who we tend to call, which is why I think these divisions should be kind of questioned and taken cum grano salis, you know? People who we tend to call Western Marxists are actually all from the East, or some of them, like Lukács, come from the East. So the father of Western Marxism is actually, at the same time placed as somebody who is a relatively known and accepted player within Eastern, as it were, Marxism. And many of these people, I mean, if you take Lenin, who also reacts, you know, the person who first mentions the concept of unequal development, you know, I mean, but the idea of consciousness and why this is also important for the political organizing. I think, you know, one can't really maintain that, you know, the cold stream is necessarily always just epistemological, that it's dry epistemology and that it doesn't involve certain questions. I mean, Lo Surdo, I think, is, to take more recent example, paradigmatic example actually of this, paradigmatic example of the inability to really, you know, make a clear-cut distinction between the two, because I don't see, and he himself says, well, how can you separate the two? You know, I don't think that people can be, you know, that they have certain needs, as it were, you know, needs which are, be it whatever, anthropological, you know, people are religious or not religious. I mean, Lo Surdo was not a guy who would say, oh, you can't, you know, you can't believe and you can't express your faith. I mean, it's ridiculous. The fact that he didn't theorize this in a way that Bloch did, and the fact that he does not give the valence of to it, which Bloch, for example, gives, doesn't mean that he's neglecting this as a human experience altogether, because he isn't, you know. And I think the question of recognition, which Lo Surdo is so well to, you know, to kind of show its possibilities, but also its limitations. I think the question of recognition is actually crucial here to understand this, because it also relates to what I was saying earlier, to this kind of dialectics of emancipation, this emancipation which is co-natural to every revolution, you know. And on the one hand, if you take, you know, it's two paradigmatic books like Perry Anderson, Considerations on Western Marxism. The end is, you know, when the masses speak, the intellectuals will be silent. And Russell Jacoby, Dialectics of Defeat. The arguments are kind of, you know, disregarding the fact that there is an afterword to Perry Anderson's book where he, you know, negates half of the things that he said in the book, more or less. But it's, you know, he says we don't have a theory of, you know, of the state and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of things which Marxist theory needs to do. We haven't incorporated all the historical knowledges that, you know, it's quite, the afterword is actually quite interesting. But disregarding that, Russell Jacoby says, well, you can't measure a movement by a success. You know, that's not a measure unit for a Marxist. So the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, to an extent even Yugoslav Revolution, they're all taken as, or the Cuban Revolution, because they succeeded, you know, in a way succeeded, whatever that means, although there are people who will say that they failed and so on and so forth. That's been the dogma, kind of the dogma of the last 30 years, that we did the solution of the USSR. Obviously, the historic evidence that communism as such had failed is precisely in the very fact that, you know, it dissolved and did not survive. But I think both Perry Anderson and Russell Jacoby in their own way make a valid point. You know, they're both, but what's missing in both is kind of the next step, which is the kind of the dialectical moment. So yes, both are right and wrong at the same time. That's kind of the point. And one more thing, I remember kind of a couple of years ago, and I think it's still kind of among the certain kind of philosophers which border with negative thought, let's say, not necessarily negative thought, but borderline, within that kind of tradition. There was the a great popularity of anarchism, anarche. So, relating this to the Derridian ideas and blah, blah, blah. So the idea was that you had anarchist kind of movement or movements or ultra-left movements or whatever, which are impersonal. So they're not named by a leader, as it were. They're not Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist, Titoist, and so on and so forth. And hence this would be some kind of evidence of their difference and being better to being better than these which are personalist, as it were, and named after some leader, which is a ridiculous claim, because the point is, I don't think that Marxists necessarily, and I agree with Perry Anderson, we don't use history enough in a way. And one has to understand these movements, so-called personalist movements, as arising from a particular historical experience. And it is a historical fact that these movements have defeated historical fascism, and there is, and Nazism, and there is no discussion and debate about it, Okay, we can now pose the question, would they have done it without, a strong discipline, a party, without being named after somebody, although, the naming came later. It certainly wasn't, they didn't name the Communist Party of Yugoslavia Tito's party. I mean, Tito didn't name it like that. It was named probably by somebody during the Cold War. I mean, I don't know where the names came from, but it's just ridiculous to think that Tito said, this is a Tito. We can talk about, obviously, bureaucracy and degeneration and all of these things, but it's just, it's ridiculous to think that they named it. Stalin came out and said, this is a Stalinist party. It was obvious from some other things that were being done, where the things were going, but it's, doubtful that he came out and said that this is a Stalinist party. And on the other hand, these anarchist movements, which were impersonal and which are, for this very reason, somehow more acceptable, attractive. Whereas historically, anarchism had and ultra-leftism, they had their own set of problems. And many of the people who were in these movements in the end betrayed revolution. Not all of them, but many of them did. Many of them joined the dark side and so on and so forth. So these are all open questions within a history which took place, and one can't really reduce it again to this, a neat counterposition between personalists and impersonalists. It's like Hare Krishna and Buddhists. The Buddhists are impersonalists, Hare Krishnas are ultimately personalists, and then we have to necessarily get into a squabble.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because we took off from your reflection there from the question of epistemology, and that led you to an interesting reflection on the question, frankly, of leadership and what in the Leninist tradition is the problem of imputed consciousness, or the problem of how does one facilitate the movement from the subject-object dualism of the class in itself for itself movement, of the revolutionary activation of the working class movement, and what is the role of intellectuals within that movement. Of course, we know that Lukács's mid to late 60s preface to History and Class Consciousness diagnoses the problem of imputed consciousness as an unfinished problem. And I've mentioned that in several of my videos on this channel.
Oh, Daniel, just one point while it's on my mind, again, against this kind of neat counterposition. When I edited my book on the Yugoslav Women's Anti-Fascist Front, the English translation was published with Viewpoint, and it can be certainly downloaded on the internet. And just briefly, kind of to present not the book but the movement itself to the public. It's one of the largest revolutionary women's movements after probably China and Russia. and it was modeled after Russian Genotel. So I don't want to go into the genealogy and it was also modeled on some. These were my findings from the archive on certain bourgeois, the previous bourgeois models of feminism within the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. But that's not the point. The point is when you take Tito. One would say Tito, it's a cold stream of Marxism. Tito is a Stalinist, vulgar economism, la la la, blah blah blah. But during the Second World War, and this was the official policy of the Popular Front, which succeeded somewhere, didn't succeed elsewhere. Again, historical questions, which I kind of deal with in my text. But what is the point? In order to mobilize the population, and you have to understand that 90% of the population of at the time Kingdom of Yugoslavia was illiterate, so they are peasants. They are mostly peasants. How do you mobilize them? Well, you go, and the newspapers which we analyzed, Žena u borbi, Woman in Struggle, which was the a newspaper of this front. Women's revolutionary organization called Anti-Fascist Women's Front. What did they do? They presented the call for the struggle, the call to arms, as it were, using the local traditions of Uskoci, Hajduci, which Eric Hobsbawm, as a historian of his one of a kind, mentions, and these are popular traditions of the, for example, some of these members of these, some people would say gangs, but anyway, they fought the Agas against, they rebelled against the Ottoman empire, and were members of the various uprisings that took part in the region, and so on and so forth. So the cold stream Titoist, personalist cold stream regime uses these kind of warm stream, as it were, uses these national popular traditions to mobilize the illiterate peasants basically to the struggle, and they succeeded. Obviously, of course, it's not just that they succeeded because of this, that they used the it's because obviously the Germans and the Italians, the war was very complicated in former Yugoslavia, but there were local collaborators, there were fascist occupiers, and then the fascist occupiers, the politics was put the local people one against the other, and that's also what the Yugoslav Communist Party managed to use and to make it work for them. So the idea that the occupiers would not themselves always directly do things, although they obviously did, but they would put local population against one another, if you follow, and that was their tactic. But I'm saying that it's not always so easy. And then obviously, like any revolution, Yugoslav revolution, like Russian revolution, had its own moments and elements of what Losurdo would call, and not just Losurdo, emancipation, disemancipation, which are both internal and external, one should say. It's not just that the Yugoslav revolution failed because there were external pressures, but there were also internal moments and problems and elements, and the very early on the bureaucratization and so on and so forth. And in the end, dissolving these very authentic bottom-up committees of the anti-fascist struggle, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting that the cold stream is an analytic of an unmasking of ideologies, and revealing of domination, a propaganda, right? Could include a lot of different tactics, right? And of course, the history of the workers' movement in the 19th century, it was not Marx's Capital that was the main text for that unmasking. There was other texts. And I think a lot of contemporary Marxists, I think perhaps rightly, say that Capital, of course, is Marx's finest achievement, and that it must be our kind of guide, or our guiding post for the unmasking of ideologies. I think that's true. However, what in your mind is the role of the early Marx in today's time? And I know that you're somebody that really because in the last time we had you on, you said you reject this Althusserian.
By the way, take Althusser. What would you say? Is Althusser cold stream or warm stream? Where is he placed? Usually Western Marxism, that would be a kind of a cold, warm stream, not really a cold stream. Cold stream is usually kind of, moving more towards the east. But Althusser,
he's paradoxical, right?
Because, there you go.
Yeah. No, because I agree with Isabel Garo, which when she says that, well, paradoxically, Althusser extinguishes the centrality of political economy in whatever is left of his praxis. So in a sense, what you could say is that he doesn't make an adequate synthesis of the cold and the warm. I think that's valid. I think there's something problematic there.
But Marxism is science, theory. That's a classic, cold stream. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, that's not all there is to him. It's what I'm saying.
Well, he's cold stream, but he purges the economism of and the dogmatism of the Stalinism that he encountered in French communism. So he achieves something very different. But perhaps two questions remain for me. One is, where does epistemology and ontology coincide for you? And can you say more about your kind of latent hostility to epistemology and Marxist practice? I wasn't exactly clear how they interact in your vision. Can you say something more about that? Not so much for like Bloch or another Marxist, but for you. How do you understand this?
Yeah, it's not. I don't have a clear cut answer. It's just my kind of formation has not predominantly been Anglo-Saxon, and therefore I think Marxism as a philosophy, because you can say that Marxism has many different elements to it. It's a theory of history, it is a theory of politics, it is a philosophy, it is many things at once. I think philosophy is, Marxism is philosophy, if you want, but also philosophy tout court, if you want, is irreducible to epistemology. And I think the 20th century, most trends in the 20th century philosophy, including Marxism, or some trends in Marxism, are actually a proof of the impossibility. Why? Because epistemology is not always, but almost always, reducible, or it reduces itself to a certain kind of positivism. That's at least my understanding, and I think that's something that Marxists should be attentive to. So that's kind of a very short answer to a very, very complicated question, which can be surely elaborated further. And as for ontology, I don't consider myself, neither a Blochian nor Lukácsian, nor but I do consider myself somebody who thinks that their lessons are valuable, and what we can learn from them is, and again, this is a kind of what, the anticipation, the human being as the most immature, as Bloch says, of all animals, and the fact that we are still at the beginning. So if we take this as our initial thoughts, that we are at the beginning in both Lukácsian and Blochian sense, what might this mean for us? Where does ontology fit? And we have to think this as having the whole experience behind and therefore in front of us. And the experience has shown that without proposing some ontology, in other words, remaining within epistemological framework, if you want, hard economism, whatever you want to call the different versions of real existing socialism that we had, unless we think of or try to propose a new ontology, I think that all our epistemological attempts are doomed to failure, and that's kind of the simple answer. I know elaborating ontology is quite different. Somebody might say, the question which I mentioned earlier, for example, the question of recognition, and in Anglo-Saxon philosophy, it is often reduced to kind of an epistemological question, completely obliterating its ontological dimension, whereas I think that this is kind of not possible. So to this extent, to think about the revolutions and revolutionary legacy not as something which is necessarily done and over with, but as something that we can still take lessons from. And one of the things that, for example, a philosopher like Losurdo would say is that the legacy of, for example, October Revolution are anti-colonial struggles, and anti-colonial struggles which we in today's world still need to be able to think and to conceive, unless we really accept the idea of, Herrenvolk democracy, which Losurdo proposes. And I think that that's kind of a big danger, and that epistemology leads to remaining merely within the epistemological framework, leads us to this, that is failing to recognize the rest of the world. And I'm now talking about the, imperialism, which is still existing. It is not something that belongs to the past. It is something that we are watching every day. And I think it is our duty as Marxists to conceive new anti-imperialist struggles as, containing both, yes, epistemological questions or hard, dry theory, economy, whatever you want to place there, but also allowing for the more utopian, if you want, potential, utopia in the sense of Bloch. And what is the difference for Bloch, There is a difference between faith and utopia, and I don't think Marxists should be, that Marxist ideas and thoughts should be based on faith, because Bloch is very clear, and I really tend to agree with him here. Faith cannot fool you. Faith is blind, Utopia can. And therefore, this is something I think, something that we should all bear in mind, Faith is blind. You believe because you believe, Imagine being fervent Christian in one of those sects in America, or a Wahhabi member of the Sunnis. Like, you have no problems, Everything is explained by the mere fact of having faith. Whereas believing in utopia is believing in a different kind of project,
Okay, so I'm sort of struck by your comment that because we're at the beginning, we need to develop a ontology that would be adequate for the future, for the road ahead, and of course it must be said that when did Alain Badiou write his ontology, being an event which now has 3 installments, but exactly when the Soviet Union fell. So
now that you mentioned Badiou, I want to mention other philosophers.
Because one Badiou, in response to your provocation, would say, well, he has provided it.
Yes and no.
Yeah, well, then of course you can say, well, it's not adequate, but he has tried.
No, that's I respect Badiou for that. That's certainly something, an attempt worthy, of philosophical attention and grappling with. But I also do want to mention other philosopher which we failed to mention, or I failed to mention, which is also a philosopher very dear to me, and somebody who is, which is Daniel Ben Said, namely, and a philosopher who, in his, all of his, more or less, one could say, all of his major books, kind of awakens this tradition of utopian, messianic, warm stream Marxism, goes back to, resuscitating the past, as it were, a la Benjamin, goes back not so much to Bloch, more to Benjamin, and goes to Peggy and many of the figures. One would say, okay, why would a Marxist do that?
Joan
But
of
why
Arc.
does he
Yeah.
do that? In order to repropose the orthodoxy, and that's what I find fascinating in Ben Said. The whole thing, the whole elaboration, the whole idea is to repropose the orthodoxy, because what is Marxism without tradition? And that's, I think, the concept which I wanted to talk about, but for some reason the discussion maybe went in different direction. Both cold and warm stream Marxisms are, I think, not united, but both have something in common, and that is the concept of tradition. What is left without tradition? Is there a left without tradition? I think the answer is no. The answer is no.
Yeah. In other words, Bloch and Ben Said and other
Bloch does it as well, to repropose in his own way. Now you can say, okay, I dislike this way, I blah blah blah, but it's also to repropose the Leninist orthodoxy.
Well, and Alain Badiou, to his credit, does the same thing, and but again, that to me is both that is an epistemological domain of work and research and study in order to arrive at a new foundation of a proposal for an ontological vision in some way. So again, we almost need to think of the two as quite in synthesis with one another. And yes, I mean, atheism and Christianity is an interesting intervention by Bloch. I think that in some sense, your example that you cited of how these feminist movements utilized tradition, I wanted to actually ask you a question regarding that, which was, were they successful in that in the way that they appropriated in that appropriation, or did your studies lead you to conclude that less so? Like, what was the kind of
They were absolutely successful. They defeated, they defeated the enemy, and the enemy was big Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and local collaborators. It is an achievement worthy of basically. And today, when people are talking about the movements of resistance and partisan movements, and Yugoslavia so many times is left out. I mean, it's one of the few countries in Europe which actually really did have its own. Let me repeat, partisan movement which defeated the occupying forces and the local collaborators. So yes, they were absolutely successful, but this doesn't mean that things can be repeated twice.
Yeah, because we have an experience in the United States with our deeply embedded Protestant subconscious. The evangelical institutions are very strong. They've been supported by the state. They've been bolstered by the state. They have a very thick ideological presence in working class communities. It's a perennial challenge because the capacity to transcend their inbuilt reactionary impediments and tendencies is most of the time proven almost impossible to do. But at the same time, there needs to be a incursion into those spaces, right? Because this whole notion that the left should never engage with certain types of tradition or should no platform them and so on and so forth. That I think is an even worse prognostication, which we see quite a lot. But I'm not convinced, based on recent history, especially during the Iraq War, for example. I'm not convinced that within evangelical Christianity, just to take one example, that these same appropriations can really succeed.
No, obviously. I mean, that's in the end, I don't want to be like, in the end, we are all Heracliteans and you can't step into the same river twice, blah, blah, blah. But there is, the thing that I, always say, there is no recipe for class struggle.
Right. Well, I mean, exactly. But there are these limits too. Like we even see these young young kids online talking about like patriotic socialism, and like the only way to reach the American working class is through some kind of nationalist script or narrative.
No, obviously. I mean, that's an idea that any socialist should oppose, immediately from the very beginning.
Nonetheless, if you take a figure like Joan of Arc for Ben Said, she's only used by the right wing nationalists. So that's a different type of appropriation. So there are, like, even Michael Hart tried to
Yeah, but
write.
she's too far in the past to
She's still
yeah.
open. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even like there are exactly, there are figures that are open for a contestation in some sense.
So in former Yugoslavia, you have the example of Gavrilo Princip, for example, the guy who killed the Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian prince, as it were, and his wife. And they always like to say his pregnant wife, although she wasn't pregnant. But all the liberal critics and everybody, they say pregnant as if, to make the crime even worse, although she wasn't pregnant. And after, obviously, during the Yugoslav epoch or period, Gavrilo Princip was considered to be a national hero, the beginning of anti-colonial struggle, which it was, by the way. I mean, it was a very complex movement, young Bosna, like young Turks, was something that was, happening within those parts of Europe. But at the same time, they read, from Morris to Rosa Luxemburg to Karl Marx and Chernyshevsky. So, their reading list was quite, and they were all very young. I'm saying like extremely young people. But today, when Yugoslavia obviously, fell apart after the dissolution, the creation of the new nation states, Serbian right-wing Chetniks, the collaborators during the Second World War, they now they've overtaken Gavrilo Princip as the, because he was an ethnic Serb, and therefore they're now inscribing him into the tradition of the Serbian long struggle of the Serbian people and nation for, independence, which is completely ridiculous because, they were Yugoslavs and they consider themselves to be Yugoslavs. Yes, they were used in different ways, but that's irrelevant. They were Yugoslavists by their own ideological streamings, as it were. Everybody else now considers him to be a criminal. Everybody else considers him to be a criminal. So within a span of 50 years, this figure has been appropriated, disappropriated, and reappropriated in very different ways. And many other figures, cultural, historical, and so on and so forth, in former Yugoslavia as well. So the same with the monuments to Red Army that we see happening and tearing down those monuments, which is completely illiterate, obnoxious, and completely far from historical truth in many of those cases, basically. Whereas the Second World War collaborators and in some cases even outright fascists are being celebrated. So it's a complete kind of reversal. Which is another theme which I'm interested, which cuts through all of these things, which is, the question of historical revisionism and, what is revisionism, Revisionism can come from the left, it can come from the right. It depends on the historical context, In former Yugoslavia, the revisionism comes from the right, but in Greece, for example, it comes from the left because the balance of powers is different, the balance of power, of domination, and so on and so forth is different. So in former Yugoslavia, the revisionists are on the right or from the right. In Greece, for example, it's the left. So it's a perennial, difficult, and important question in the end, of course.
Wanted to ask you, I love this concept in Lo Sodo of emancipation and disemancipation. Wanted to ask you to help kind of clarify. I mean, is one way to understand this idea as revolution and counter-revolution? What is your understanding of this? I guess it's a dialectical concept, right? Could you say something more about emancipation and disemancipation? Because I think it's very valuable.
I think I kind of spoke about it a little bit earlier, and I think it's not easy because it also requires, and this is something again that, for example, Perry Anderson writes in the considerations on the Western Marxism. It also requires that we critically approach and question the Marxist theory itself. And it depends from the tools. So using, obviously, history, I'm absolutely in agreement there with Perry Anderson. But on the other hand, it also depends which tools you use and how you approach this questioning, and I think that that's kind of the crucial to understand the dialectics of emancipation, disemancipation, which is kind of connatural with social movements today, if you want, with revolutionary movements, certainly, the necessary bifurcation. This is not in the sense of Ben Said, but simply the word bifurcation. So the forking of parts between what is, what was the real program and what were the real achievements, as it were. What were the real things that happened. And I think it is it's absolutely necessary that there be disjunction between the two.
Yeah, because it's kind of an offshoot of the warm stream within a movement, which is that it has a tendency to, from the position of the masses program, obviously, there's not a perfect symmetry about what's achieved, right? If there was, then we would have some kind of highly positivist, ultra teleological history of revolution, which of course has never been that way. So simply the idea of emancipation and disemancipation is the gap or the difference between what the ideological program of the revolutionary movement purports. And
but it's also internal. It's both internal and external. So if you think about the the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, whatever you want to call it, there is the external pressure, but there are also internal issues and questions. Stalin is not how can I put it? Simply an abomination. He's the outcome, the result of certain things. So I think that these two things are quite important to understand. Bloch calls Stalin the Tsar. I mean, the fact that he puts the sanctity of the family, bans abortion, and many other things, which he did. I'm just talking now from the feminist perspective, and finally dissolves the Genodel, the women's organization, is it's quite relevant, and it's not accidental, as it were. It's not accidental. It is the outcome of certain internal contradictions and processes of emancipation, disemancipation, which are not necessarily just the result of the external pressures, but as within every movement or party, are also questions of internal democracy and internal ordering of things, if you want. So I think that's kind of also important to have in mind.
Yeah, that's a brilliant concept. I suppose we, as a great left-wing Aristotelian who focuses a lot on ontology, who I know you've studied, maybe you studied with him, Agamben, has not come up in this conversation. But it seems to me that something about his work strikes me as picking up a certain suggestions of Bloch, perhaps. And I wanted to ask you, just invite you to reflect perhaps on Agamben and the question of ontology.
That's I'm not really an expert on Agamben, and I have to say that my very kind of modest. I mean, I did read him, but I can't say that I could now discuss him. But my favorite book is the one which is unfamiliar to a majority of the people, and it's called Signatura Rerum sul Metodo. So the list of things, as it were, on method. So that's my kind of one of my favorite books on Agamben, and I would refrain from commenting on his ontology in particular, because he has recently had interesting kind of. I would like to read his PhD in theology, because he finished maybe 6-7 years ago in Switzerland. He defended a doctorate in theology as well, I believe, on St. Paul. So I think, it's a very complex question. It's like I don't feel like I'm all that competent to now talk about it, because it has a completely kind of other element to it. It's like the Benjamin and the question of Jewish messianism. It's there, and I don't feel that I'm kind of the competent person to discuss it. And I don't think that you can think Agamben without Benjamin as well.
Yeah.
In particular in these religious
And
aspects.
what was the relationship between Bloch and Benjamin? Do you know much about this, perhaps?
I mean, I know what most other people know, but allegedly they did have. I think Benjamin had sent some of his things to Bloch, who was a bit senior, and I think that they did have the agreement precisely in these kind of religious and mystical moments or elements to the human thought. So I think that there was a kind of an agreement, but I don't think that the relationship really went much further.
Got it. Wonderful. Beautiful. This has been very.
And in the end, Daniel, what we should say, that this is like, Marx is also someone who says religion is a heart in a heartless world.
No.
And that there is this side to Marx that is also, Marx is often, in particular, I'm saying, by the mainstream, whipped as somebody who is, cold and calculated, and somebody who brought the biggest evils to this world. How the lib and libertarian criticisms go, but it's at the same time, he's a person who wrote the thesis on Feuerbach, which are contain, as it were, in themselves some, in my view, mystical impulse, and is somebody who is able to say that religion is also heart in a heartless world. And as long as this is the case, and this is obviously the impetus for much of utopian thought, utopia is going to be necessary, and it's going to be posed as our never-ending and always beginning process.
Yeah, it's amazing that Bloch was able to resurrect the centrality, to point to the centrality of utopia without cheapening this concept from obviously Marxist polemics with all of the utopian socialists, for which there were so many. And of course, during the time of Marx, those utopian socialists had followers which far outnumbered Marx's followers. So that itself is an important achievement, that he kind of redignified the meaning of utopia.
Who would you say, Daniel, is the a philosopher who should be part of the warm stream canon, as it were, and maybe isn't considered thus?
Well, the first thing I was going to say is that where Bloch's influence is most paramount is actually in Friedrich Jameson. Okay, because if you read Jameson, you'll notice countless references to Ernst Bloch in Jameson's entire understanding of the totality and his understanding of ideology. It's very Bloch.
Utopia and so on and so forth.
Oh yeah. Obviously, the text in Utopia. Okay. Well, I mean, that's part of the reason why I wanted to ask about Agamben. How might we fit him? It's a tough one. I mean, in a sense, now after this conversation, I'm of the mind that in reality, it is perhaps foolish to think of a Marxist as a Marxist that's worth reading, who would only be one. Because any Marxist that's worth reading must possess some mode of interrogation of both. Otherwise, like Badiou, Badiou, you could accuse of being a pure warm streamer, because people say he's Rousseauist, people say he's voluntarist, people say he says nothing about political economy, which is actually not true, incidentally. There is a way to
largely true, but okay.
So in that sense, well, you'd have to say Does Badiou have an account for the unmasking of ideologies of domination? Well, yes, he does, but it's not vis-a-vis an economistic focus on the categories that Marx develops in Capital. Famously, Badiou says that there was no crisis in capitalism during May 68, the event that seized him. He really does tend to deprivilege the critique of political economy. So that would be my answer. But I'm a little not yet sure if it's fair to bracket him fully in that way. On the flip side, I think there are an abundance of purely cold stream Marxists that are amongst us. And one of the problems
They're
that
mostly Anglo-Saxon, aren't they?
yeah, they're mostly Anglo-Saxon. I mean, when Michael Heinrich says that worldview Marxism is over, and all of the implications with such a claim, I think is a perfect indication that which says that all we need is cold stream Marxism. And the problem with that is that what's to be made of liberating potential of the masses, you cede all of that ground to liberalism. That's my problem. So cold stream Marxism is liberal Marxism, I think. And that's a problem, because I think warm stream Marxism provides an adequate alternative to the, let's say, to the hegemony of liberalism. Because remember, liberalism has its own way of rerouting emancipation movements. It reroutes them into other false outlets. So that's a big danger. I'm more concerned about that. I'm less concerned about, like, I don't know, warm stream reductivists. There's less.
I'm in agreement there a bit with Russell Jacoby that what we tendentially would call in Bloch's definition the cold stream Marxism ends up measuring things according to certain measure of utility, and that is certainly not a measure for any Marxist or left movement. And I think that's a fairly basic, I think, position that we need to depart from. So in that sense, but I'm also, as I said, against kind of neatly counterposing any of these things. It's just it's given that it's not always possible, it's not possible in most of the cases. Therefore, it is shouldn't be considered as entertained as the idea which we should employ.
Well, I think you could say post-Marxists, such as like Hartenegri and Leclau and Move, might be warm stream without any adequate cold, like they're the opposite problem of Heinrich, which is they're like purely warm stream. And why? Precisely because in their analytic, right, in their analysis, they basically give a fatalist position, which is capitalism is untranscendable. So as such,
it's ceding, to defeat permanently, and that is the problem with that.
Yeah. So it's
like the novel Q. I don't know if you know the Luther Blissett.
Yeah.
It's like that kind of a novel, and everything is like defeat until the multitude asserts itself, and then every defeat is presented as victory.
Yeah, this is like the kind of, I would say like left-wing accelerationism, which I think is highly problematic itself, is warm stream without, so like,
is I it? I think the okay.
Well, okay. I'm only defining it as warm stream precisely in the sense that, it's an if cold stream is defined by the adequate revelation or disenchantment of forms of domination as a precursor to emancipation, well, they don't have that really. They don't care to have that. So therefore, they only focus on the praxis in some sense. They only focus on this and this kind of, but the way that they conceive of that practice, the way they conceive of that contestation of capital is problematic precisely because the presuppositions that go into it assume that capitalism is untranscendable and things of this nature. So it's a kind of stunted, I don't know, maybe it's neither. Maybe it's neither. I'm not sure. But But nonetheless, it's a very valid, heuristic that he gives us, right, to think through. Um, and I think what it also implies is that it's a challenge to any Marxist to incorporate both of these orientations. I don't think we should walk away thinking that one should be either one or the other. I don't think this is right. I think you agree. So I think we've made some headway. I know many questions remain, and people can comment for further follow up. We can have a part two. I'm happy to do whatever. Block is tough. It's difficult material.
But it's also interminable source of really kind of inspiration. And as I wrote on Twitter, kind of preparing for this, I was just, I would take something in the evening and just kind of read some text. And this text of his from his book, which is the post-war mostly political essays, Politische Messungen, and this text called Bread and Dance, which, I mean, it's a very Hegelian kind of idea that you first have to be, you have to be fed in order to be able to, to dedicate yourself to action, practice, theory, thought, whatever. But on the other hand, it's so kind of full of his own thoughts and ideas, and the idea of dreaming, daydreaming, bad dreams, badly fed dreams, he says, which I quite nourished, which actually fed would be a better translation, is what gives rise to kitsch, and Nazism is the paradigmatic example of this kitsch, and it's actually a very Hegelian. I mean, some people, very orthodox Hegelians, would say no, it's not Hegelian at all, but I think it is very Hegelian if one can accept a bit more heterodox philosophical reading. Otherwise it would be fairly boring to try to permanently put things in the box. I mean, then we can say goodbye to philosophy, and in that case, we don't need philosophy at all. Which is not really.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's so much to be done with Bloch and ecology, with Bloch and the climate catastrophe, because he's a thinker of the future. He's a thinker of hope, of optimistic horizons, which is precisely these areas of consciousness which are absent from contemporary radical thinking in those movements. So he's somebody that must be read and reread for ideology critique, for practice oriented critique, all of his stuff on art and music. It's just endless. It's endless. And again, I think it's very readable personally, but still, nonetheless, the ontological side. I mean, what we really need is the problem of materialism. I guess you could translate it that way. That needs to come out in English. That would be good. That would be helpful.
I don't want to be mean, but the English translations of Bloch are painful.
Not very good. Yeah, okay.
Not very good and painful. I mean, I congratulate to all people who struggle with the English translations of Bloch, because it is a heroic endeavor, basically, to go through that. Basically, I see it as a form of torture, personally.
Tijana, I want to thank you for coming on to the show. I think we've covered a lot of ground. You really helped us understand this epistemology, this ontology. Obviously, you've helped us understand the warm and the cold. Really appreciate all of the diversions into Lukács and the example of your research with the feminist movements and the anti-fascism. Really, really helpful, and I hope that folks enjoyed this conversation. Tijana is definitely one of my favorite guests, and I hope that you grace us with your presence in the future.
Thank you, Daniel, and everybody. Hi and bye.
Thanks. Next time.